I'm Cole. I'm the postdoc working at Sacramento Institute, supervised by David Minsky. And a lot of what we do in the lab is focusing kind of on the fundamental signal processing and steps required to do and answer interesting questions in neuroscience. So my talk is on pose tracking, which is, how do you get behavior from video data? And we'll start just kind of with a perspective on what we're interested in. So I'm also a part of the International Brain Laboratory. So I have this nice video of a mouse that's just moving a wheel based on a stimulus and trying to move the stimulus to the center of a screen, and then it gets some sort of reward afterwards, right? So we have this nice video of the mouse doing this, and we're interested in asking all sorts of questions, just like other people in behavioral neuroscience, about what are the neural mechanisms of things like decision making or reward? How does the brain take sensory information like the contrast of the stimulus and use that to guide its behavior? And then also just how is it actually controlling or representing the movement that the mouse is doing at a time, right? So there's all these rich questions that we're interested in asking, but to get there, we need to first actually quantify the behavior at a high temporal resolution. So maybe everyone kind of seen this, but the idea is, deep learning has enabled us to start doing pose tracking from images. So given a bunch of labeled images, right, you hand label where the key points are in the image, you can train some sort of neural network. And this neural network could be pre-trained on a bunch of other images from ImageNet, but you can pre-train it to output heat maps for where each of these key points are in space. And then once you have those key points, you can predict on new videos, in these heat maps, you can predict on new videos like what the mouse or animal is doing in the video. So this loop of image labeling, network training, video prediction can be done multiple times until you're happy and you have all your behavior quantified. And this is a super well-studied problem, both within and outside of neuroscience. So these are just some of the models. Sorry if I missed some, but we tried to quantify just how many models have come out that cover pose tracking specifically for neuroscience. And there's all sorts of innovations, like multi-animal tracking, where you have multiple animals doing interactions, right? It becomes more challenging to differentiate the pose of each of those animals. There's been things on 3D, right? So if you have multiple cameras, how do you quantify where the animal is in a three-dimensional space so you can get its full skeleton? And recently there's some work that we worked on in our lab, which is focused on semi-supervised tracking. How do you utilize all this unlabeled video to kind of give spatial temporal constraints on the pose tracking? So using things like temporal smoothness or consistency between views, or even just exploiting that we know that animal pose is lower dimensional than it could possibly be. Since you have multiple points in space, it's not like a mouse is going to distort its skeleton too much, right? So there's been all these innovations for pose tracking. And at this point, right, it's a supervised problem, all these innovations come out, is this a solved problem? So today, I think it's a good chance to talk about things that are not working so well. So for example, this is just on IBL data. We trained a lot of networks, and by we, I mean other people, trained a lot of networks to try to predict, the pupil, try to get the pupil diameter, and also to predict the pause of the animal while it's moving the wheel. And you can see one of the challenges is, during hard frames where things are occluded, or maybe this is a slightly misaligned camera, it can cause these glitches to occur, maybe at different times. You can see on the left, the whisking is causing the points to kind of bounce around. On the right, you see that when the paws kind of overlap, you'll see a jump every once in a while between the points. And these aren't just kind of random jumps, I embedded a little video. You can see that sometimes it could be kind of essential to the hypothesis you're interested in testing, right? So it can happen at times when you have two animals when they're actually interacting, because that's when things start to get confusing, and that might be the thing you're actually interested in. So you can see in this example that we put the lightning pose model on top, but you can see there's two models, the lightning pose model, or semi-supervised one on top, and the baseline. And both, you'll see when the animals approach each other, the skeleton starts to jump around a bit. And even when the wire interacts, right, you can see that the skeleton starts to lose its shape. And maybe what you're interested in, if the mouse is facing a certain way or if they're touching each other, all of a sudden that information is going to be damaged by these glitches. So this problem, just going back to the workshop, just to be fun, I can't believe it's not better, right? It's a supervised task. We have a lot of image data. Why is this not working? And how can we try to move towards fixing this? So this is a slightly different perspective, is that we realize that these glitches are not always the same type of glitch, depending on even the random initialization of the network. So what you can see is like these glitches that occur, like this mouse is dragging its leg a bit, which made it hard to kind of estimate where its left hind is. You can see that at these points where it's hard, all the networks kind of jump at different times and in different ways, right? So this is kind of something that might be exploitable. If we look into it, right? Oh, whoops, am I still in viewing mode? What happened to, oh, I think I pressed escape. All right, we'll go back. So yeah, this is something that might be exploitable. So say we had a test view. How do we utilize random initializations of the same network, right? The most classic thing you can do is take a bunch of networks, train them on this data set, generate a lot of predictions for the same thing, and then do some sort of ensemble mean, ensemble median, right? It's super basic, right? And so it's solved. No, this doesn't actually work in practice. It does make it better. What we found is, even for this data set where we have this mouse running on this wheel, and there's a camera, like there's a mirror under it, you still see that even common post-processing methods like median filter or these ensemble mean and medians can't seem to solve these glitches, because when everything glitches, right, the mean and median becomes less meaningful for tracking like what's going on, right? Because you can glitch and one thing can throw the mean off completely. So you can see that we couldn't solve these glitches just by ensemble. But one thing that's missing from these ensemble methods is that, given what we know, is that easy key points, everything's pretty consistent. And hard key points, everything kind of jumps around, right? The variance explodes on the ensemble. So how do we actually exploit this to do something for pose tracking, right? How do we utilize the variance and not just the mean and the median? So what we did was we took the same picture here, but now we have the ensemble means and the ensemble variances. And we want to build a method that can take both those things and make predictions, right? So this is what we call the ensemble common smoother. And what it does is, you can imagine that it's a latent variable model where our latent state is the pose we're interested in tracking. The observation is the ensemble means from the networks. And the observation noise is the ensemble variances. So now we have a kind of a natural framework for, when the observations are reliable, there'll be lower noise. And when it's less reliable, there'll be more variance, right? And the smoother can then utilize its kind of latent trajectory over time. And we can put temporal and spatial constraints on this type of model. So here's a couple versions of this model we constructed for pose tracking. First one is just a generic temporal smoothing. You can enforce some sort of smoothness over time by putting some sort of parameter on the on the covariance matrix of this common smoother. And then you have an identity transform from the latent back to the observation. So this is basically saying we want to apply some temporal smoothness over the trajectory, but we're not fundamentally changing the trajectory that we're interested in. It's just temporal smoothing. Another is multi-camera smoothing. So imagine you had multiple cameras. Then if you take, this is something maybe I should expand upon, but the idea is if you have multiple views of the same key point, right, there's some underlying three-dimensional key point that will represent that, and you can reproject it back to the camera views. So what we do is we take a multi-view principal component analysis to get a three-dimensional latent, and then we smooth that one over time, with this method. So this is another way where the latent is like a three-dimensional point. And then the observation matrix is the inverse of that principal component analysis. And then last but not least is, for us, we built a pupil smoother. So for IBL, the top, it's a diamond basically. The top and the bottom of the pupil and the sides of the pupil. And we realized, that's 8-dimensional technically, x, y, x, y, x, y. But we can actually represent this as a 3-dimensional thing where you have the center of the pupil and the diameter of the diamond. So we have this, this smoother where the latent is actually the diameter and just the center of the eye where it moves around. So that's all of these are different forms, but they're all part of this ensemble common smoothing framework because we're just constraining the latents in different ways. So kind of seeing this in action, on this mouse data set, we use both the temporal and the multi-view. It does seem to resolve these glitches. And what we see is that something that is not quantified that much in pose tracking is that there's actually easy frames and hard frames for pose tracking, right? Everyone kind of just computes pixel error. But if you look at the ensemble variance as a measure of how easy or hard things are, common methods actually start to fail dramatically when the variance is high on the ensemble. Basically, it doesn't know what it's doing, right? So that's kind of how we laid out these results. You can see that the ensemble smoothing does improve performance across both easy and the hard frames for this mouse data set. And you can see this in action. Basically, going back to this, pupil data set, the glitches now are largely resolved by this kind of approach, where everything's so whenever there's an occlusion and things kind of jump around, the model knows to rely kind of on previous observations and smooth things out, right? So this is now what we're using for the IBL pupil tracking. And you can see it, that it's not just the smoothing that's important, it's also important for if you're trying to do prediction of a variable using neural activity, right? We actually found that the predictability of this variable given neural activity increases with this approach as well, using our lightning pose and also this ensemble Kalman smoothing. But you can see that, and then another example is just with the social interactions again. This green skeleton is the smooth version, and the red skeleton, which is kind of jumping around, is just the ensemble members themselves. So you can see during social interaction too, you want to keep the consistency and the smoothness of the predictions. And let's let this run for a bit so you can see it in action. They interact for a while, but what you can see kind of the previous methods really struggle a bit with like when the mouse is compressing on itself or when the wire is kind of jumping all over the place and it causes the red skeletons to freak out. But so this is kind of something that we've quantified across many different data sets, and we think is something that would be valuable for not just mouse, but also for like multi-view, like for fish. We have some fish tracking, we have the social interaction tracking, and again we see the results are kind of consistently good across both easy and hard frames, where the ensemble variance is that measure. So what do we actually gain from this? So I think to make this not so much just a PR talk, what can we learn from these approaches? One thing is, we really try very hard to train a model and just get it to work, and then if it doesn't work, we throw it out, we try a new model. I really think if we have the compute, train more models, just ensemble, and there might be something really interesting you can do with those results later that would maybe free up some time if you're spending all your time trying to fix glitches or problems and things like that, right? These kind of approaches, well, this is the PR part, it is pose tracking agnostic, right? I'm not saying any pose tracker is, any pose tracker that's doing 3D or multi-view, or multiple animal interactions, right? This kind of approach can improve the performance of many different methods, depending, not even lightning pose, the one that I was talking about, so it could be used in a lot of different contexts. I think research too in pose tracking has been very focused on how do we improve these models with spatial temporal constraints and these kind of things, but more focus can go on, how do we best utilize ensembles of models, right? Not as much research has gone into this. When you look at pose tracking, there's very little literature on how do we ensemble predictions. And I think there's a lot of work in the machine learning community to do ensembles, and maybe digging into that and utilizing that to do improvements on pose tracking is something that is a missed opportunity currently. And then one more direction we think is really exciting is how do we take a really good post-processed, EKS thing where you have 10 different models, right? And that's going to be expensive, but can you amortize this cost back to the model training? So not just improving the ensembling, but how do we use these, these ensembles to then inform our model training? So imagine to train 10 models, you use the ensemble Kalman smoother to predict, a bunch of unlabeled video, and then you fed this back into a neural network and retrained the neural network, right? So trying to amortize this back to a single network could help with computational constraints. So I think there's a lot of really rich ideas, but maybe it necessitates moving beyond how do we make one network do everything, right? There's a lot of room for exploring this kind of multi-network approach. So that's it for my talk. Huge shout out to everyone who worked on this, especially the authors of Lightning Pose, Matt and Dan. Matt helped run, I think made almost all these plots, I feel. So huge shout out to Matt. And yeah. Check out our repos, but also just think about ensembling and generally, maybe just new perspectives on the same problem would be really valuable. So I think that's kind of the point of this workshop and why I was excited to talk about this specific work.